When King Charles IV of France, the last direct male heir of the Capetian dynasty, died in 1328 without a son, Europe trembled at the uncertainty that followed. The Capetian line had ruled France for more than 3 centuries, weaving a network of feudal loyalties and dynastic marriages that defined the medieval political order. Yet for all its grandeur, the dynasty ended in silence. No heir to continue its name, no clear successor to carry its crown. What followed would not only ignite one of the longest and most consequential wars in European history, but would also redefine what it meant to be a nation. Edward III of England was 21 when he heard the news of Charles's death. The young English king, already proving his mettle on the throne, had a claim that by blood seemed legitimate enough to unsettle the French court. His mother, Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV and sister to Charles IV, was a Capetian princess. By her, Edward carried the French royal bloodline. In a world governed by feudal oaths and divine right, blood mattered. Perhaps more than armies, more than coin, more than reason itself. But the question was not merely of lineage, it was of law, power, and pride. In France, the lords and councillors gathered in Paris to deliberate. The kingdom could not fall into English hands. That much was clear to them. To have the King of England also wear the crown of France would, in their eyes, dissolve the French realm into foreign control. The French nobles invoked an old legal principle, later known as the Salic law, which barred succession through the female line. Though this law had rarely been cited in royal inheritance before, it suddenly became the cornerstone of French legitimacy. A woman, the reasoning went, could not transmit a claim to the throne any more than she could wield a sword in battle. And so, in 1328, the French assembled at Vincennes and elected Philip of Valois, cousin to the deceased Charles IV, as the rightful king. He was crowned Philip VI, the first of a new dynasty. To the French, this was a restoration of order. To Edward III, it was a betrayal. For several years, Edward did not challenge the decision openly. His own kingdom had seen turmoil, the rebellion of Roger Mortimer, the aftershocks of his father's deposition, and a delicate peace with Scotland that demanded his attention. But the resentment simmered beneath the surface, a quiet, steady anger that would one day erupt into open war. The issue of succession was not the only tension between the two kingdoms. Economic threads bound England and France together, and it was those threads that began to fray first. English wool fed the looms of Flanders, a wealthy region in what is now Belgium and northern France. The towns of Ghent, Bruges and Ypres depended on English exports for their prosperity. Yet Flanders owed nominal allegiance to the French crown, creating a tangled triangle of loyalties. When Philip VI began to exert his authority over the Flemish towns and threaten their trade with England, Edward saw both a challenge and an opportunity. The merchants of Flanders looked to England for support, and Edward, always shrewd in his politics, recognized that the struggle for the French crown could begin not on French soil, but in the marketplaces and harbors that connected them. The flow of wool, gold and cloth became the silent front of the early war. Diplomacy turned to economic pressure, and embargoes became weapons as potent as any sword. By 1336, Philip VI had made an alliance with the Scots, the traditional enemies of England. This move, meant to check English power on both sides of the Channel, was a direct provocation. Edward III, sensing the winds of war, began to forge alliances of his own among the discontented princes of the Low Countries and the Holy Roman Empire. The stage was set not by a single insult or invasion, but by years of quiet maneuvering. The kings played a game of strategy across courts and ports, across borders and parchments. Then came 1337, the year that historians mark as the true beginning of the 100 Years' War. Philip VI, angered by Edward's defiance and alliances, declared the English territories in France, most notably Aquitaine, forfeit. To Philip, it was an assertion of feudal law. To Edward, it was an act of war. In response, Edward took a step that would change European politics forever. On January 26, 1340, he formally claimed the title King of France. That declaration was more than symbolic. By claiming the French crown, Edward was not simply challenging Philip's rule. He was attacking the very legitimacy of the Valois dynasty. He began minting coins bearing the fleur-de-lis and sealing letters with the arms of France and England quartered together. His heralds carried banners across the Channel, and his ships, sleek, sturdy vessels manned by hardened sailors from the Cinque Ports, began to patrol the northern seas. It was at sea, not on land, that the first real clashes took place. The English and French navies skirmished along the coasts of Brittany and Flanders. These were small battles, raids, ambushes and captures, but their symbolism was immense. Control of the Channel meant control of the war's lifeline. Both nations understood that a kingdom's might depended as much on trade and supply as on the valor of its knights. The most significant of these early confrontations came at Sluys in 1340. Edward, commanding a fleet of around 200 ships, encountered a French armada anchored in the estuary near the Flemish coast. The French fleet, confident in its position, chained its ships together to form a floating fortress. But Edward's tactical mind, already renowned even in his youth, saw through the defence. With the wind at his back and the sun glinting off his banners, the English fleet struck hard and fast. Archers lined the decks, loosing volleys that tore through the French crews. Grappling hooks and boarding bridges followed, and within hours the French navy lay shattered. It was a brutal, chaotic battle, the sea thick with wreckage and blood. Chroniclers later wrote that the English victory at Sluys was so complete that the sea seemed to be covered with bodies rather than waves. It was not merely a naval triumph, it was a declaration that England had come to challenge France in every domain, by sword, by ship, and by crown. Yet even in victory, Edward's ambitions were constrained. His continental allies were unreliable, their loyalties purchased by gold that drained the English treasury. The great campaign he envisioned to reclaim France had to wait. The papacy called for peace, mediators intervened, and truces flickered and failed like candles in a storm. Both sides claimed righteousness, both wrapped their cause in divine favor, and both continued to prepare for the greater conflict that everyone now knew was inevitable. But beneath the politics and battles, deeper changes were already at work. The war was beginning to expose the fragility of the medieval world, the one built on feudal bonds and knightly codes. Kings were no longer just lords among lords, they were becoming symbols of nations. When Edward claimed the French crown, he did so not only as a feudal vassal asserting his rights, but as a monarch representing a people, the English. Across the Channel, Philip VI's defiance stirred a similar awakening among the French. The war, though rooted in dynastic ambition, began to forge something far greater, the idea of national identity, and so the 100 Years. War did not begin with a thunderous charge or the clash of armies in the field. It began with legal arguments, royal seals, and calculated insults. It began in the minds of kings and the parchments of their scribes. The first weapons were pride and parchment, ambition and law, and they would prove just as deadly as any sword. What neither Edward nor Philip could have foreseen was that their quarrel would span generations. Sons would inherit their father's causes. Princes would be born into conflict. The 100 Years' War would outlive both of them, reshaping not only England and France, but the very nature of warfare, sovereignty and power in Europe. For now, however, the seeds had been sown. The fields of Flanders and the harbours of Normandy whispered of the storm to come. a war that would burn for more than a century. The Battle of Sluys in 1340 was more than an English victory. It was a revelation. For the first time in living memory, France's pride upon the seas had been swept aside. The English fleet, under Edward III's direct command, had carved its dominance across the Channel, and from that moment onward, the waters between the two kingdoms became less a barrier and more a bridge of conquest. The sea lanes hummed with English supply ships, carrying archers, men-at-arms and engineers, an entire nation preparing to march across the heart of France. For Philip VI, the defeat at Sluys was both humiliating and alarming. France's coasts were exposed, its trade disrupted, yet he clung to confidence born of centuries of Capetian might. The French army still possessed the greatest cavalry in Europe, the flower of chivalry, thousands of mounted knights trained from birth to fight in glittering armor beneath banners that bore the weight of history. In their minds, a single charge of French lances could sweep aside any foe, no matter how determined. Edward III, however, was not a medieval dreamer. He was a strategist, pragmatic and precise. He understood that war was changing, and he intended to lead that change. Between 1340 and 1346, England underwent one of the most ambitious military preparations of the Middle Ages. New ships were built, contracts signed with mercenaries, and longbowmen, the backbone of English warfare, were trained and gathered from across the shires. The longbow, a weapon of simple wood and string, would soon prove more powerful than 100 suits of armor. By the summer of 1346, the English king was ready. His fleet landed on the Norman coast at Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue in July, nearly 15,000 strong. Normandy had been the ancestral home of the English kings centuries before. Now Edward returned not as a vassal, but as a conqueror. His campaign began with calculated ferocity. Harbours burned, towns sacked, and storehouses emptied. It was not mere pillage, but strategy. He sought to draw Philip VI into battle on ground of his choosing, to bleed France not only militarily, but economically and psychologically. The French, however, were unprepared. Philip's court was slow to mobilize, and the fragmented feudal levies of France could not assemble with the speed of Edward VI's disciplined army. When news of the English invasion reached Paris, panic rippled through the countryside. Rumors spread that the English were devils, that their arrows blotted out the sun, that God himself favored them. For many French peasants, the war was not a noble cause, but a plague, burning their homes and trampling their fields. As Edward's army advanced northward, his men left behind a trail of fire. Rouen was threatened. Caen was taken after fierce resistance, and the riches of Normandy poured into English hands. Yet Edward's ambition reached further. He marched toward the Somme, seeking to join with his Flemish allies. Philip, now fully aware of the danger, mustered his forces and pursued. The stage was set for one of the most defining battles in European history, the Battle of Crécy. It was late August 1346 when the two armies met near the small village of Crécy and Agincourt. The French outnumbered the English nearly 2-1, perhaps more, boasting tens of thousands of knights, crossbowmen and men-at-arms. The English, though fewer, held a secret advantage: their discipline, their position, and the deadly reach of their longbows. Edward had chosen his battlefield carefully, positioning his army on a gentle slope, with fields open to his front, and flanks protected by natural obstacles. The ground was dry at first, but rain had fallen earlier that day, turning the soil to slick mud, a small detail that would soon prove devastating to the French cavalry. As the sun dipped low, the thunder of hooves began. The French vanguard, led by the famed Genoese crossbowmen in Philip's employ, advanced to open the battle. They loosed their bolts into the English lines, but their weapons were slow to reload, and the wet strings slackened their power. Then came the reply, a sound like tearing cloth and breaking storms. The English longbowmen, thousands strong, released a hail of arrows that darkened the sky. Their shafts struck with terrible accuracy and speed, piercing armor, killing horses, and shattering formations. The Genoese broke and fled, only to be cut down by their own French allies for cowardice. In the chaos that followed, the French knights surged forward, their banners whipping in the wind, their armor gleaming despite the rain and mud. They charged uphill into a storm of arrows. Horses screamed, knights fell, and the field became a slaughter. Again and again, Philip ordered new assaults, and again they were broken upon the wall of English archery and discipline. Among the English stood Edward's son, the 16-year-old Edward, Prince of Wales, known to history as the Black Prince. It was his first major battle, and his courage under fire would become legendary. When his line wavered, he stood firm, rallying his men as arrows flew overhead and French lances crashed upon their shields. King Edward, watching from a nearby windmill, refused to send reinforcements, saying, "Let the boy win his spurs." And so he did. By nightfall, the field of Crécy was a graveyard of French nobility. The blind King of Bohemia, who had ridden into battle tied to his men's horses, was found dead among them, his banner soaked in blood. Countless barons, knights and nobles lay fallen, victims not of equal combat, but of a new kind of warfare that rendered their chivalric ideals obsolete. When the sun rose the next morning, Edward III surveyed the carnage. He ordered his men to give thanks to God, not to boast of victory. The Battle of Crécy was not merely an English triumph, it was a revolution. The longbow had proven that courage and armor alone no longer decided wars. Precision, discipline, and tactics could overcome even the mightiest cavalry charge. The age of the mounted knight was fading, and a new era of warfare, one of common soldiers and professional armies, had begun. Philip VI retreated in humiliation. His army was shattered, his nobility decimated, but Edward did not rest on victory. He turned his sights toward the coast, toward a prize that would secure England's hold on the continent for generations to come, the port city of Calais. The siege began in September 1346 and lasted nearly a year. Calais, a wealthy and fortified city, stood as France's gateway to the Channel. Edward encircled it by land and sea, cutting off all supplies. The French attempted to break the siege several times but failed. Starvation gripped the city. Its people ate dogs, rats, and leather to survive. Inside Calais, desperation turned to despair. The townspeople knew that no relief would come. When the city finally surrendered in August 1347, Edward demanded that 6 of its leading citizens come before him barefoot, with ropes around their necks, bearing the keys to the city. The 6 burghers, led by Eustache de Saint-Pierre, stepped forward in silence, ready to die for their people. Chroniclers record that Queen Philippa of Hainault, moved by pity, pleaded with her husband to spare them, and Edward relented. Their lives were spared, but Calais fell into English hands, where it would remain for over 2 centuries. The fall of Calais was more than a military victory. It was a symbol of endurance and control. England now had a foothold in France unlike any before, a base from which it could strike, supply and trade. For the French, it was a humiliation that cut deep into their pride. For the English, it was the birth of a new confidence, a belief that they were not merely an island nation, but a continental power. Yet beneath the triumph, darker omens loomed. The devastation of war was spreading across northern France, villages burned, crops ruined, and thousands of peasants displaced. The chivalric ideals of noble warfare gave way to the brutal reality of medieval conflict. Ransoms, raids, and scorched earth became the new order. And in the shadows of this destruction, famine and plague gathered strength. The years between Crécy and Calais marked the true awakening of English military power. Edward III had shown that strategy, logistics and technology could defeat even the grandest armies of Europe. He had forged his son into a warrior prince and his soldiers into professionals. The world was beginning to change, and though the war would pause in uneasy truces, its spirit had only just begun to stir. The thunder of Crécy still echoed across France, carried by the wind and remembered in fear. The French would rebuild, the English would fortify. The struggle for France was no longer a question of feudal rights or inheritance. It had become a battle for destiny itself. The year 1348 arrived not with trumpets or banners, but with silence, an invisible terror creeping along the trade routes of Europe. The armies that had thundered across France now halted, not by treaties or kings, but by a force neither sword nor prayer could defeat. The plague came first to the ports, riding the same ships that once carried armies and supplies. Rats scurried down the gangplanks, fleas nestled in their fur, and from them spread the Black Death. It struck with cruel swiftness. In the crowded ports of the Channel and the narrow streets of Rouen, in London's marketplaces and Paris's alleys, death walked unseen. No army could stop it. Men spoke of punishment from God, of stars gone wrong, of poisoned wells. Some blamed strangers, others witches, still others their own sins. But there was no reason to be found, only fear. The plague respected no borders. Kings and beggars alike fled before it. In England, the bells that once rang for victory at Crécy now tolled for the dead. Monks who copied chronicles of the war turned instead to listing the fallen. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart wrote of entire villages left empty, of fields untended, of livestock wandering without masters. He said, "It seemed to men that the end of the world had come." By the time the pestilence had passed, perhaps 1 in every 3 souls in Europe was gone. In some towns, half the population perished. In others, none remained to bury the dead. The war that had raged across Normandy and Picardy fell silent, not from truce, but from exhaustion. The soldiers who survived returned home to find families gone and fields overgrown. The once glorious armies of England and France were ghosts of themselves. For Edward III, the conqueror of Crécy and Calais, the plague was a cruel reminder of mortality. His triumphs suddenly felt hollow. He had claimed to fight for dynastic rights and the honor of his crown, but now even kings could not command life. His court, like all of Europe, fell into mourning. The Black Prince, his heir, saw the world darken around him, his father's glory fading beneath the shadow of an unseen enemy. In France, Philip VI's reign ended amidst despair. His kingdom lay in ruins, villages burned, cities depopulated, the treasury drained. When he died in 1350, the crown passed to his son, John II, known as John the Good. Yet even this new king could not rebuild what had been lost. The war had crippled France, the plague had nearly finished it. But as the dead were buried and the survivors staggered from their grief, something remarkable began to stir. The old order of lords and serfs, of obedience and silence, had been shaken to its core. Laborers found themselves suddenly precious. Fields could not be tilled without them. Cities could not function. Armies could not be raised. Wages rose, demands grew, and the balance of power began to tilt from the noble to the commoner. In England, this change sowed the seeds of future revolt. Peasants, once bound by feudal obligation, discovered their value. Laws were passed to freeze wages and bind workers to their lords, but resentment smoldered. The plague had not only killed millions, it had awakened a sense of defiance among the living. As Europe staggered into the 1350s, both kingdoms faced a decision: rebuild in peace or resume the struggle that had defined a generation. Edward III, ever restless, turned again to war. Though his armies had been thinned by disease, his ambition had not. Across the Channel, John II of France sought to reclaim his father's honor and drive the English out once and for all. The fragile silence of the plague years began to break. In 1355, the storm returned. The Black Prince led a devastating campaign through southwestern France, a chevauchée or mounted raid, burning, looting and terrorizing the countryside. His men rode through Gascony, Languedoc and Toulouse, leaving ash and ruin behind. It was warfare not for conquest, but for destruction, designed to cripple France's economy and demoralize its people. King John II gathered his forces to meet the threat. In 1356, near the town of Poitiers, the two armies clashed. Once again, English discipline and the longbow triumphed over French valor. The Black Prince, calm and ruthless, captured King John himself in battle, a humiliation unmatched in French history. The capture of a monarch by a foreign prince shook Europe to its core. For years, France had fought to preserve her pride and sovereignty. Now, her king was a prisoner in London, her nobles held for ransom, and her lands overrun. The ransom demanded by the English, 3 million gold écus, was staggering, a fortune that would drain France for decades. But even in captivity, John the Good tried to act with dignity. He negotiated, promised loyalty, and struggled to maintain the honor of his crown. In 1360, the two sides met to end this ruinous phase of war. The result was the Treaty of Bretigny, a moment of exhausted compromise between two nations bled dry. Under the treaty, Edward III agreed to renounce his claim to the French crown, a symbolic retreat from his grandest ambition. In exchange, France ceded vast territories to England, much of Aquitaine, Gascony, and parts of northern France. It was a victory in name, but a hollow one. The war had devoured treasure, lives, and spirit on both sides. For Edward, the treaty offered respite. For France, it offered survival. Yet the peace that followed was not peace born of reconciliation, but of fatigue. Both nations were haunted by the memory of plague, by the ghosts of battlefields, by the knowledge that neither had truly won. In England, Edward returned to his splendor, but his kingdom was not the same. The court glittered, but beneath the golden banners, the old chivalric dream had begun to fade. Too many dead, too many burned villages, too many graves. In France, the countryside remained scarred. Bandits and mercenaries, known as the routiers, roamed freely, preying upon peasants and travelers. The crown's authority was weak. Rebellion flared in the cities. Even the ransom of King John became a burden that crushed the people. And when John, still held in honorable captivity in London, learned that his son had escaped as a hostage, he returned voluntarily to England, to die there in 1364, a prisoner of his own conscience. The years between 1348 and 1360 stand as the most haunting interlude of the 100 Years' War. The swords had fallen silent, but only because death itself had claimed the field. The great armies that once clashed beneath fluttering banners had been thinned by plague and despair. The ideals of knighthood, honor, courage and feudal loyalty seemed hollow against the reality of pestilence and hunger. Yet, from this darkness emerged transformation. The world that had gone to war in 1337 was not the same world that emerged in 1360. The war had become less about chivalric duels and more about survival, less about crowns and more about kingdoms changing shape. The old medieval order, shaken by plague and war, was giving way to something new: stronger monarchies, professional armies, and the faint stirrings of national identity. The Treaty of Bretigny closed one chapter, but the ink had barely dried before resentment began to stir once more. France would never accept humiliation for long, and England, though weary, would not abandon its continental dream. The peace was a pause, not an ending, a fragile calm built on exhaustion, not trust. The fields of France began once again to grow green. The bells that had tolled for the dead now rang for harvest. But beneath that fragile renewal, the seeds of vengeance were already taking root. The Black Death had swept away half of Europe, but it could not kill ambition, pride, or memory. And as the plague faded into history, men turned again to the oldest story of all, the struggle for power. The Treaty of Bretigny had promised peace, but peace in the 14th century was a fragile dream, easily written, quickly broken. Though France lay shattered after years of invasion, plague and humiliation, its spirit was not dead. Beneath the ashes of defeat, a quiet determination began to take root, and from that soil rose a king who would restore his nation, not through brute force, but through patience, intellect, and endurance. His name was Charles V of France, remembered by his people as Charles the Wise. Charles V inherited a wounded kingdom. When he came to the throne in 1364, France was divided between English-occupied territories, rebellious provinces, and ravaged lands overrun by mercenary bands. The countryside was lawless. Fields lay untilled, castles abandoned, villages burned. The crown's coffers were empty, and faith in monarchy itself seemed broken. Yet Charles was not a warrior like his father John II, nor a fiery conqueror like Edward III. He was a scholar king, a man who read the stars, studied the law, and governed not with the sword, but with calculation. From the moment of his coronation, Charles understood that France could not outfight England in open battle. He had seen what had happened at Crécy and Poitiers, the folly of charging arrows with armor, so he chose a different kind of war, one of attrition, intelligence, and subtlety. His weapon would not be the knight's lance, but the general's mind. And to wield that weapon, he found his champion, Bertrand du Guesclin. Du Guesclin was no courtly knight. He was coarse, scarred, and famously ugly, with a face that chroniclers described as black and flat as a butcher's board. Yet in him burned a relentless will. Born in Brittany, of minor nobility, he had fought since youth, not for glory, but for France itself. Under Charles, du Guesclin became the embodiment of a new kind of hero, cunning, loyal, and utterly pragmatic. Together, Charles and du Guesclin forged a campaign unlike any France had seen before. They avoided large-scale battles, instead favoring sieges, ambushes, and relentless harassment. They reclaimed towns one by one, cutting off English supply lines, sowing unrest in English-held regions, and slowly strangling their enemies' control. It was war transformed from spectacle into strategy, painfully slow but devastatingly effective. Meanwhile, across the Channel, England was beginning to falter. The glory that had once shone at Crécy and Poitiers was dimming. Edward III, once the embodiment of English vigour, was now aging, his health failing, his court riddled with intrigue. His great heir, Edward the Black Prince, who had blazed across France as a conqueror, began to wither as well. In 1367, the Black Prince fought his last great battle at Nájera in Spain. He had gone south to support Pedro the Cruel of Castile against Henry of Trastamara, who was backed by France and du Guesclin. The battle was a triumph. The French-backed forces were crushed and the prince stood once again victorious. But victory brought no reward. The campaign bankrupted him, drained his strength, and destroyed his health. The once mighty warrior, who had led charges at Crécy and captured a king at Poitiers, now suffered from illness, likely dysentery or a wasting disease that would haunt him until his death. Worse still, his reputation in Aquitaine began to collapse. His heavy taxes to fund war angered the local lords, and his harsh rule bred resentment. The very lands won through fire, and blood began to slip away, not through battle but through rebellion. France, under Charles V's patient guidance, seized the opportunity. Du Guesclin swept through the southwest, reclaiming town after town: Poitiers, Limoges, Bergerac. English garrisons surrendered, not out of fear, but out of hunger and hopelessness. By the late 1370s, the English Empire in France, the great dream of Edward III, was crumbling. Normandy was lost. Brittany was unstable. The Duchy of Aquitaine, once a jewel of English rule, was fractured by revolt. The tide had turned completely. The victories of the past now seemed distant echoes of a forgotten age. At the same time, the world itself was changing. The ideal of chivalry, the shining code that once defined knighthood, was dying a slow death. No longer did nobles ride to battle for glory or honor. They fought now for coin, for ransom, for survival. Mercenaries filled the ranks of both armies, men loyal to paymasters, not kings. The banners still fluttered, but the meaning behind them was hollow. England felt the strain deeply. The cost of maintaining garrisons across France, paying soldiers and sustaining the fleet, drained the treasury. The economy faltered, taxes soared, and resentment spread among the people. In Parliament, voices rose questioning the endless war. What was the point, they asked, of claiming a foreign crown when the homeland itself grew poorer and weaker? Even within the royal family, fractures appeared. Edward III's later years were clouded by tragedy and corruption. His beloved Queen Philippa died in 1369, the same year that France officially renewed hostilities. The king's health declined, his court fell under the influence of greedy courtiers, and his once great leadership faded into melancholy. The Black Prince, too sick to govern, returned to England in 1371 and withdrew from public life, his body failing but his pride unbroken. Meanwhile, in France, Charles V's reforms were bearing fruit. He rebuilt the royal treasury through careful taxation and fiscal discipline. He founded the first royal library at the Louvre, gathering manuscripts and fostering learning. He restored faith in the monarchy and re-established order across his kingdom. His France was not the France of his father, a realm of chaos and defeat, but a reborn nation, unified under reason and law. By the time of his death in 1380, Charles V had turned disaster into stability. The English held only Calais and a few coastal enclaves. The rest of their French dominions were gone. France, once prostrate and broken, now stood proud again. The same year, Edward III of England died, an old man surrounded by memories of glory long past. His grandson Richard II ascended the throne, a child of 10, inheriting a realm burdened with debt, disillusionment, and fatigue. The English people no longer spoke of destiny or divine right. They spoke of taxes, of corruption, of sons lost to a war that seemed eternal. The Black Prince, the golden hero of a generation, had already died the year before his father, wasted away before his time. His armor, once bright with conquest, was blackened with age and regret. Chroniclers wrote of him with awe, yet also pity, a symbol of England's rise and fall, of chivalry's promise and its price. By 1380, the 100 Years' War had already lasted over 40 years. Thousands were dead, cities ruined, kingdoms drained. The banners of both sides still flew, but beneath them marched men who no longer believed in the cause. The dream of glory had decayed into endurance. The peasants of France, the yeomen of England, they saw no kings or heroes in this war, only the endless burden of survival. In both lands, discontent simmered. The Black Death had shaken the social order, and now taxation for war fanned the embers of revolt. In 1381, England itself would erupt in rebellion, peasants marching to London, demanding justice from a crown that could no longer afford to listen. The war between England and France had begun with questions of inheritance and pride, of kings and crowns. By the time Charles V died, it had become something else entirely, a struggle that transcended bloodlines and thrones. It was now a war of endurance, of identity, of nations learning what it meant to exist. And yet, the story was far from over. France, though restored, would soon face new challenges. England, though weakened, would find in its young king and restless lords a new thirst for power. The century was not yet half spent, and the fires of war still smouldered beneath the ashes of peace. The next generation would not remember Crécy or Poitiers firsthand, but they would inherit their ghosts. The peace that Charles V of France had built through wisdom and patience began to crumble almost as soon as he was laid to rest. His death in 1380 left the crown to his 11-year-old son, Charles VI, a boy surrounded not by loyal advisors but by ambitious uncles. France, newly reborn, was again at risk of tearing itself apart. Across the Channel, the same curse of youth and instability plagued England. The child King Richard II, grandson of Edward III, ascended the throne in that same turbulent year. Thus began one of the strangest, most tragic chapters in the 100 Years' War, when both kingdoms, so long locked in struggle, found themselves ruled by kings unfit to rule. In France, the regency of Charles VI was dominated by his uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry and Anjou. They were men of immense wealth and pride, each with their own armies and ambitions. The boy king's inheritance was soon devoured by their rivalries. They drained the treasury with luxury and favoritism, undoing the careful discipline Charles V had instilled. The countryside, still recovering from decades of war, once again descended into poverty and unrest. When Charles VI came of age, he attempted to restore order. He dismissed his uncles and placed his trust in a new circle of advisors, known as the marmousets, competent, loyal servants of the crown. Under their guidance, France briefly recovered. Taxes were stabilized, justice reformed, and the common people began to hope that the wisdom of the father might yet live on in the son. But fate had other plans. In 1392, during a military expedition to Brittany, something broke within Charles VI. As the army rode through a forest near Le Mans, the king suddenly drew his sword and attacked his own men, striking down several before he was subdued. When he regained consciousness, he remembered nothing. From that moment on, his mind would never truly return. The madness came and went in waves. At times, Charles believed he was made of glass and could shatter if touched. He forgot his wife, his children, even his own name. He ran through the palace screaming that enemies pursued him, or sat in silence for hours, unblinking, unresponsive. Chroniclers described him wandering the halls in rags, filthy and confused, unable to recognize his courtiers. France had no king in spirit, only in name. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, became the de facto ruler, but she too was distrusted and accused of corruption and infidelity. Into the vacuum stepped the powerful dukes once again, foremost among them the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, and later his son John the Fearless. Their rivalry with the Duke of Orléans, the king's brother, split France into two bitter factions, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs. This division would prove fatal. The French nobility, once united under Charles V, now turned their swords against one another. Civil war loomed. Across the Channel, England fared no better. Richard II, crowned at 10, had inherited a nation exhausted by war and rebellion. The peasants' revolt of 1381 was his first great test, a storm of fury that swept across southern England. Towns were burned, tax collectors slain, and London itself invaded by rebels demanding justice and freedom. For a moment, the boy king showed courage beyond his years. Facing the mob at Smithfield, he promised reforms and peace, calming the crowd. But once the revolt subsided, he broke his word, hunting down its leaders and restoring the old order with vengeance. That moment marked the beginning of Richard's descent, not into madness like Charles VI, but into paranoia. As he grew older, Richard's reign became defined by suspicion, vanity, and cruelty. He surrounded himself with flatterers and punished those who opposed him. His barons, men like the Duke of Gloucester and the Earl of Arundel, resented his extravagance and the French-style court he imitated. Richard saw plots everywhere. His obsession with royal authority deepened until he ruled not as a monarch among nobles, but as a tyrant among subjects. In 1397, he struck back. His enemies were arrested, executed, or exiled. For 2 years, Richard ruled England with iron resolve, but no love. His people, weary of his pride, began to turn against him. The final blow came from his own blood. Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, the son of the late John of Gaunt and one of Richard's exiled cousins, returned to England in 1399 while the king was campaigning in Ireland. With astonishing speed, Henry gathered support from disaffected nobles and seized control. When Richard returned, he found himself abandoned. He surrendered without a fight. In September 1399, in Westminster Hall, Richard II was forced to abdicate. His crown passed to Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster. Richard was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, where he died months later, almost certainly murdered. England had traded one form of instability for another. Henry IV's reign began with rebellion and doubt. He had usurped a divinely anointed king, and that stain would haunt him to the grave. His early years were marked by uprisings, the revolt of the Welsh under Owain Glyndwr, the northern lords led by the Percys, and endless conspiracies questioning his legitimacy. His body, racked by illness, mirrored the sickness of his realm. Chroniclers speak of sores, weakness, and sleepless nights. Henry ruled, but never comfortably, and while England wrestled with rebellion, France dissolved into civil war. The assassination of the Duke of Orléans in 1407, ordered by John the Fearless of Burgundy, plunged the kingdom into chaos. Cities declared for one faction or the other. Paris became a cauldron of bloodshed, its streets filled with mobs loyal to Burgundy or to the Armagnacs. The royal court, powerless and fractured, could only watch as France devoured itself. It was in this maelstrom that a new figure began to rise in England, the son of Henry IV, known to history as Henry of Monmouth, and later as Henry V. As a young prince, Henry was forged in conflict. He fought in Wales against Glyndwr's rebellion, where he learned discipline and command. He witnessed the treachery of noble factions, the cost of weak leadership, and the hunger of a restless nation for purpose. While his father ailed and doubted, Henry waited, silent, observant, and ambitious. When Henry IV died in 1413, England once again stood on the edge of uncertainty. But unlike his father or Richard II, the new king possessed a rare quality, clarity of vision. He understood what England lacked, a unifying cause, a revival of glory, and he knew where to find it. Across the Channel, France was in turmoil, ruled by a mad king and divided by civil war. The moment was ripe, and Henry saw in it both destiny and opportunity. The dream of conquest, dormant since the days of Edward III, flickered again. England's young king, barely 26, believed he could succeed where his ancestors had failed, not by accident of battle, but through divine will. His faith was absolute, his determination unbreakable. As he took the throne, he swore to restore order at home and honor abroad. He cleansed the court of corruption, reconciled feuding nobles, and rebuilt the treasury. His rule began with prayer and preparation, as though guided by a higher hand. While France spiraled deeper into its madness, England found in Henry V a new sense of direction. A return to the old fire of Crécy and Poitiers, now tempered with discipline and vision. Two kingdoms had wandered through shadow for decades, haunted by weak kings and fractured loyalties. Now, from that darkness, a new era was about to dawn, one that would define the very soul of the 100 Years' War. It would not be ruled by reason nor by peace, but by steel, faith, and the audacity of youth. The fields of France would soon echo again with the sound of English drums, and the name of Henry V would be carried by the wind as both conqueror and saviour. When Henry V ascended the English throne in 1413, Europe scarcely took notice. He was young, only 26, the son of a usurper whose legitimacy was questioned even in his own court. England was weary, battered by rebellion, debt, and division. Yet within 2 years, that same weary kingdom would roar back onto the world stage, guided by a monarch who saw himself not merely as a king, but as an instrument of divine will. Henry's reign began with purpose. From the first days of his coronation, he set out to heal the fractures that had splintered England since the fall of Richard II. He restored the rights of exiled nobles, reconciled bitter families, and brought order to a realm exhausted by intrigue. His austerity impressed even his critics. Chroniclers record him as a man of strict piety and military discipline, temperate in appetite, relentless in focus, and unbending in conviction. He abolished the excesses of Richard's court and the instability of his father's rule. Justice, in his words, was to run swift and even as God commands, but beneath that moral order lay a deeper ambition. Henry believed himself chosen to fulfill a destiny that had eluded his ancestors, the unification of the crowns of England and France under one sovereign. To him, the claim was not political vanity, it was divine inheritance. He was the rightful heir, descended from Edward III, whose blood still cried out for acknowledgement. Across the Channel, France was divided, weak and bleeding from within. Its king, Charles VI, still wandered in and out of madness. His wife, Queen Isabeau, ruled in his name, but held little real power. The French nobility, split between the Burgundians and Armagnacs, tore the realm apart. Towns changed allegiance like the tides. Mercenaries roamed the countryside unchecked. To Henry, it was not conquest he sought. It was redemption. In 1415, after months of diplomatic exchange and failed negotiations, he gathered his army at Southampton. Chroniclers tell of him walking among his men before they sailed, calm, composed, speaking of duty, honor, and God's judgment. When a conspiracy against him was uncovered, led by lords who sought to restore Richard II's line, Henry acted with surgical precision. The traitors were executed swiftly, their deaths sending a message: the era of doubt was over. By late summer, his fleet crossed the Channel, landing at the mouth of the Seine. His first target was Harfleur, a fortified port near the coast. The siege of Harfleur tested his resolve. Disease and fatigue ravaged the English ranks, yet Henry's determination never faltered. "Once more unto the breach," Shakespeare would later make him say, a line that captures the essence of his spirit. For weeks, the English bombarded the town with cannon fire, their primitive artillery thundering against the medieval walls. By September, Harfleur surrendered, and the English flag was raised above its towers. But victory came at a cost. Dysentery swept through the camp, felling thousands. Many of Henry's men were too weak to fight, and winter was fast approaching. Most commanders would have returned home to regroup. Henry, instead, chose the impossible: to march his depleted army across enemy territory toward Calais, daring the French to stop him. It was an act of both faith and defiance. The French, gathering near the village of Agincourt, prepared to crush him. Their army outnumbered the English by at least 3-1, perhaps even 5-1, depending on the chronicler. They were the proud flower of French chivalry, dukes, counts, knights in gleaming armor, banners fluttering under the grey October sky. To them, Henry's campaign was madness, a fool's errand doomed to end in annihilation. The morning of October 25, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, dawned cold and wet. The field between the two armies was a long, narrow strip of ploughed farmland, soaked with days of rain. Mud clung to every boot and hoof. Henry positioned his men carefully. His army numbered perhaps 6,000, most of them longbowmen, the silent architects of England's past victories. He ordered sharpened stakes driven into the ground to repel cavalry charges. Then, with quiet composure, he removed his helmet and prayed. The French advanced, their armor glinting beneath the thin sun. But the ground betrayed them. Heavy horses sank knee-deep in the muck. The tight formation of knights funneled into chaos. Then came the English arrows, tens of thousands of them, darkening the sky. They fell like rain upon steel, finding gaps in armor, piercing visors, unhorsing nobles. The longbow had once again changed the nature of war. The French cavalry, desperate to break through, charged again and again, only to be mired in mud and corpses. The English archers, having exhausted their arrows, waded into the melee with mallets and daggers. Chroniclers describe the field as a sea of bodies, horses shrieking, knights suffocating beneath their fallen comrades. When the slaughter ended, the flower of French nobility lay dead or captured. Among them, the Constable of France, the Duke of Alençon, and countless lords whose names once filled ballads. English losses numbered in the hundreds, French in the thousands. Agincourt was more than a victory. It was vindication. Henry stood upon the field that evening, mud up to his knees, and gave thanks to God, not for triumph, but for deliverance. To his men he spoke of brotherhood, of faith rewarded, and of the eternal bond forged that day in blood and courage. Chroniclers wrote that he refused to boast, attributing all to divine will, yet even they sensed the truth. Henry V had become the embodiment of the ideal medieval king, pious, decisive, invincible. Agincourt sent shockwaves through Europe. In France, disbelief turned to despair. The factions continued their feud, oblivious to the enemy's advance. Henry, meanwhile, returned to England not as a conqueror but as a saviour. London welcomed him with processions and hymns. He had restored pride to a kingdom long shadowed by doubt. But Henry was not content with glory alone. He saw Agincourt not as an end, but as a beginning. Over the next few years, he returned to France with renewed purpose, larger armies, stronger alliances, and a clear vision of conquest. Normandy fell under his control, town after town. The French, leaderless and divided, could offer little resistance. Then came the moment of destiny. In 1419, the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, was murdered by Armagnac partisans on a bridge at Montereau. The act horrified Europe and drove Burgundy's new duke, Philip the Good, into Henry's arms. France, now split beyond repair, faced the inevitable. 2 years later, in 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed. It was a stunning reversal of history. Charles VI of France, in the presence of his court, recognized Henry V as his heir and regent of France. To seal the pact, Henry married the French king's daughter, Catherine of Valois. The union promised not just peace, but a new dynasty, a single crown uniting England and France. For a moment it seemed the 100 Years' War had found its conclusion. Chroniclers wrote that the hand of God had chosen Henry to restore order to Christendom itself. He entered Paris as a monarch in all but name. The French Dauphin, disinherited and exiled, clung to a dwindling resistance in the south. The future belonged to England, but destiny, like kingship, is fragile. In 1422, just 2 years after his greatest triumph, Henry V fell ill during a campaign near Meaux. Fever consumed him. The man who had defied the odds at Agincourt could not defy mortality. On August 31st, he died at the age of 35. His last words were of God, of France, and of his unborn son. He believed the dream of unity would endure. But even as his coffin sailed back to England, the first cracks appeared. Charles VI of France died only weeks later, leaving the infant Henry VI heir to both thrones, a baby king presiding over a dream already fading. The age of glory had ended as swiftly as it had begun. Henry V's legacy would live on in legend, the perfect king, the Christian warrior, the embodiment of medieval honor. Yet his death marked not the union of nations, but the beginning of another long descent into disillusionment. The English crown now rested upon a child, and the fire of conquest upon men who would soon forget what Henry had truly fought for. The war was not over. It was about to change forever. By 1428, the dream Henry V had forged lay in pieces. The infant Henry VI sat upon 2 thrones he could not yet comprehend, King of England by birth, King of France by treaty. But in truth, both crowns rested on fragile foundations. England's lords governed in his name, divided by ambition and greed, while in France the English held the north and Paris itself, leaving the south to the disinherited heir, the Dauphin Charles. The war seemed over, the spirit of France seemed broken. Yet history once again would turn on something no one could have foreseen, a miracle clothed in armor. France in 1428 was a land in despair. Its towns lay blackened and plundered, its fields wasted by years of invasion and civil war. Villagers whispered of ghosts on the roads, of wolves haunting the ruins of burned churches. To the common people, kings and nobles were distant shadows, their quarrels meaningless beside hunger and grief. The English held much of the north through a network of strongholds, with their gaze fixed upon the last great bastion of French resistance, the city of Orléans, guarding the Loire. When the English began their siege of Orléans in October 1428, the city's fall seemed inevitable. It was encircled, starved, and slowly strangled. The French commanders within were brave, but disorganized, their morale collapsing by the day. The Dauphin, cowering in Chinon, lacked both will and confidence. Even his allies doubted whether France could survive another year. Chroniclers described those months as a season of silence, when prayers went unanswered and hope itself seemed to have fled the realm. And then came the voice. In a small village called Domremy, far from the courts and battlefields, a peasant girl named Joan claimed to have heard celestial voices. She was 17, illiterate, the daughter of a farmer. Her world had been shaped by stories of saints and soldiers, of angels and France's lost glory. One day in the garden behind her father's house, she heard what she later called a light brighter than any flame. It spoke to her of duty, to raise the siege of Orléans and crown the Dauphin as the true king of France. Her family thought her mad. The priests dismissed her as deluded. Yet Joan's conviction was unshakable. She said her mission was not her own but God's, and she would not rest until it was fulfilled. When she left Domremy in early 1429, dressed in men's clothes for safety, she carried no sword, no riches, only faith. She travelled hundreds of miles through enemy territory, guided by peasants and soldiers who, against all reason, believed her. Word of the strange, determined girl reached the Dauphin's court at Chinon, where Charles hesitated. France was desperate, yet the idea of taking counsel from a peasant girl seemed absurd. Still, curiosity won out. When Joan was brought before him, Charles disguised himself among his courtiers to test her. She walked straight to him without hesitation. "You are the Dauphin," she said softly, "and the Son of the King of Heaven commands me to lead you to Reims, to be crowned." Those present swore she could not have known which man was he. Skepticism gave way to awe. The churchmen tested her visions. The soldiers mocked her, then marveled at her certainty. In the end, Charles took a chance. Whether born of faith or desperation, none could say. Joan was given armor, a white banner emblazoned with the names of Jesus and Mary, and command of a relief force bound for Orléans. When she rode into the city on April 29, 1429, she became a symbol overnight. Chroniclers wrote that the people of Orléans wept as they saw her enter, her banner gleaming in the torchlight, her expression calm, resolute. To them, she was not a girl, but an answer to prayer. Within days, everything changed. Joan's presence transformed despair into purpose. She ordered the soldiers to pray, to confess, to cast out their drunkenness and blasphemy. She herself slept little, praying before battle, refusing to lift her sword except in defense. Yet in her, the men saw not frailty but fire. Her courage was contagious. The English, bewildered and uneasy, dismissed her as a witch. But fear crept into their ranks. They had faced seasoned commanders before, but never faith made flesh. On May 7th, Joan led the assault on the Tourelle, the key English fortress controlling the bridge. Arrows darkened the air, cannon fire shook the walls. She climbed the ladders beside her men, her banner high. An arrow struck her shoulder. She fell, bleeding, and for a moment panic rippled through the French lines. But Joan rose again, declaring, "Do not fear, the victory is God's." Her return to the fight electrified the army. Within hours the fortress fell. The siege of Orléans was broken. For the first time in a generation, France had won a victory not of chance, but of conviction. The liberation of Orléans sent shockwaves across Europe. The English, stunned, withdrew northward. The French, reborn, rallied behind Joan and the Dauphin. Chroniclers called her La Pucelle, the Maid. Her fame spread like wildfire. Soldiers carried her banner into every skirmish. Peasants knelt as she passed. But Joan's mission was not complete. She pressed Charles to march on Reims, the ancient site where French kings were crowned. It lay deep in enemy territory, yet she insisted it was God's will. The Dauphin hesitated no longer. In June 1429, the French army advanced, town after town, opening its gates. Resistance melted before them, as though the land itself had chosen to believe again. On July 17, 1429, Charles entered Reims Cathedral. The choir sang the ancient coronation hymns as the sacred oil anointed his forehead. Joan stood nearby, holding her banner beside the new king. When the crown was placed upon his head, she knelt and whispered, "Now is fulfilled the will of God." It was the high point of her brief, blazing life. But miracles are fragile things. The following year, fortune turned. The French advance faltered, and the politics of war, so long delayed, returned to devour its savior. Joan, restless and still devoted to her mission, led an ill-fated attack near Compiègne in 1430. During the retreat, she was unhorsed and captured by Burgundian soldiers, allies of the English. The people wept, but none came to rescue her. Her captors sold her to the English for 10,000 livres, a common price for a common prisoner, but a betrayal beyond measure. In Rouen, she was put on trial for heresy by an English-backed court. The proceedings were a sham, a grotesque theatre of power cloaked in religion. Learned men accused her of witchcraft, blasphemy, and arrogance before God. Her every word was twisted, her visions mocked, her purity questioned. Yet through it all, Joan remained unbroken. When they demanded she recant her visions, she answered, "If I deny the truth, I deny God." When they threatened her with fire, she said calmly, "If it be his will, I shall endure." On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the marketplace of Rouen. The scaffold was high, the crowd vast. She asked for a cross, and one of the guards fashioned one from 2 sticks. She clutched it as the flames rose. Her last word was Jesus. Those who witnessed it swore that as the fire consumed her, a white dove rose from the smoke. Whether truth or legend, it did not matter. The maid was dead, but her spirit ignited a nation. In death, she gave France what kings and armies could not, faith in itself. Her martyrdom transformed despair into determination, superstition into unity. Even the English chroniclers, hardened by war, admitted her courage was beyond mortal measure. Charles VII, once timid and uncertain, began to act like a king. The French armies, galvanized, drove the English from the Loire and reclaimed their cities. The tide had turned, not by strategy, but by belief. Joan's body was reduced to ash, but her name became immortal. She had lifted a kingdom from ruin, restored its crown, and reminded Europe that divine purpose could wear the face of a peasant girl. From the smouldering stake at Rouen, France rose anew. The 100 Years' War was far from over, but its soul had changed. It was no longer a struggle for crowns or claims of blood. It had become a war for identity, for nationhood, for the very idea of France. The death of Joan of Arc might have seemed like the end, a closing chapter written in fire and mockery. Yet, in truth, it was a beginning. France, humiliated for decades, found in her ashes a new sense of identity. The whisper of her faith spread across the valleys and cities of a battered kingdom. Farmers, merchants and soldiers all began to believe that their homeland was more than the quarrel of kings. The spirit of France rose not from royal decrees, but from the courage of ordinary people who had seen a young woman face death without fear. The tide at last began to turn. By 1431, English rule stood firm in name but hollow in substance. They controlled Normandy, parts of Aquitaine, and the northern strongholds, but their victories had grown brittle. The alliance that had once held England's continental empire together, between English lords and French nobles loyal to them, began to unravel. Taxes drained England's treasury, morale faded. The English soldiers, once feared, now fought for wages rather than honor. The French, meanwhile, were learning to fight as one nation, not as a patchwork of feudal banners. The change was slow, almost invisible at first, but it was decisive. Charles VII, the man Joan had crowned, came into his own. At first uncertain and timid, mocked as the King of Bourges for ruling only a sliver of France, he began to govern with quiet resolve. His court gathered new men, administrators, merchants, financiers, instead of reckless nobles. Under their guidance, France reformed itself from within. The king introduced new taxes, allowing him to pay soldiers directly, rather than relying on feudal levies. This was revolutionary. It meant that loyalty now flowed from coin, not blood. The age of professional armies had arrived, and with it, the death of medieval chivalry. The English, trapped by their old system, could not adapt. They still clung to the feudal order, knights, retainers, and unpaid troops bound by honor and obligation. But in a world where cannons decided sieges and gunpowder pierced armor, honor was no longer enough. The English army was stretched thin across garrisons and fortresses, constantly harassed by French raids. The people of Normandy, once loyal or resigned to English rule, began to rebel. Charles VII capitalized on every spark of resistance, rewarding loyalty and forgiveness rather than vengeance. The first major blow came in 1436. Paris, long under English control, opened its gates to the French king. The capital's return was not just a military victory, it was symbolic resurrection. Bells that had once tolled for English coronations now rang for France again. The people flooded the streets, crying "Noel" as the French flag rose over Notre Dame. To the chroniclers, it felt like divine justice, the restoration of order in a world that had lost its balance. The years that followed saw a relentless campaign of reclamation. Town by town, fortress by fortress, the French pressed north and west. The reconquest of Normandy was the crown of this revival. Between 1449 and 1450, Charles VII launched his most daring offensive yet. The city of Rouen, England's great bastion, fell after a siege marked by discipline and strategy rather than brute force. The French no longer charged blindly into battle. They used artillery, trenches, and logistics. War had become a science. At the Battle of Formigny in 1450, the transformation was complete. The English army, relying on the same tactics that had triumphed at Crécy and Agincourt, met the new French artillery for the first time. The longbowmen, once the terror of Europe, found themselves outmatched by cannon fire that shattered their lines and scattered their formations. The French cavalry, long humbled by English arrows, rode forward not for glory, but for efficiency. It was a stunning reversal, a mirror image of Agincourt, but with the roles reversed. When the smoke cleared, the English were broken. Normandy, that proud duchy held for centuries, was gone. Its castles flew the fleur-de-lis once again. The war was not yet over, but its outcome was written. The English still clung to Gascony, still claimed their king was rightful ruler of France, but it was a fiction now, a shadow sustained by pride and memory. Meanwhile, in England, the rot deepened. The cost of the war had drained the treasury and the will of its people. Parliament bickered with the crown. Nobles, enriched by decades of spoils, turned their swords inward. The Lancastrian dynasty, born from Henry V's triumphs, began to falter under Henry VI, a gentle, pious man, but ill-suited for an age of iron. He was haunted by the same madness that had destroyed Charles VI of France. Under his reign, the kingdom drifted, leaderless and divided. The seeds of a new civil conflict, the Wars of the Roses, began to sprout. Back in France, victory brought not only pride but change. The nation that emerged in the mid-15th century was not the same as the one that had entered the 100 Years' War. It was more centralized, more disciplined, and more self-aware. The king was now more than a feudal overlord. He was the symbol of France itself. The war, which had once been a dynastic quarrel, had created the very idea of nationhood, yet the cost was beyond counting. Entire generations had known nothing but war. Fields lay fallow, towns empty, cathedrals roofless. Chroniclers wrote of wolves prowling in abandoned villages, of peasants who could not recall a year without soldiers on their roads. The land itself bore scars, trenches, ruined castles, mass graves. The war had devoured the world that had birthed it. And through it all, the memory of Joan lingered. Her story, once dismissed, became a sacred legend. She was not yet canonized, not yet a saint in the church's eyes, but among the people she already was. The soldiers carried her name into battle. The peasants whispered her prayers in the fields. The girl who had once ridden into war with a banner instead of a sword had, in death, given France the unity it had never known in life. By 1450, England's fate in France was sealed. Only Calais remained, a small coastal foothold, a reminder of what had once been. The balance of power had shifted forever. The French monarchy, nearly destroyed by madness and invasion, now stood stronger than ever before. The English monarchy, once triumphant, was on the verge of implosion. The 100 Years' War was nearing its end, but its legacy was still being written in the fields of Normandy, in the hearts of soldiers, in the halls of kings. It had begun as a feud over inheritance, a question of lineage and law. But now, it had become something larger, a crucible in which the medieval world was burned away. In its smoke and ash rose two nations, France reborn and England transformed. Yet even as one triumph took shape, another tragedy waited in the wings. For while France looked to rebuild, England would soon tear itself apart in civil war. The dream of empire was over, the age of chivalry was gone, but the story, the long, relentless story of the 100 Years' War, had one final act left to tell. By the dawn of 1450, the English in France were a shadow of their former selves, weary, fragmented, and haunted by a century of victories turned to dust. The thunder of Formigny marked the beginning of their final undoing, but the echoes of that defeat would resonate far beyond the battlefield. It was not merely the loss of land or castles, it was the death of a dream that had begun more than 100 years before, when Edward III first laid claim to the French crown. Now that dream was collapsing under the weight of time, exhaustion, and the new order of the world. The Battle of Formigny, fought on April 15, 1450, in the green fields of Normandy, was small by the standards of history, yet its consequences were immense. The English, led by Sir Thomas Kyriel, marched to relieve the besieged town of Formigny, unaware that they were walking into the jaws of a trap. The French commanders, Jean de Bourbon, Count of Clermont, and Arthur de Richemont, Constable of France, had learned from a century of defeats. They no longer charged blindly against longbowmen. They waited, measured, calculated. When the English took their position and began to unleash their famed arrows, the French did not scatter in panic as they had at Crécy or Poitiers. Instead, they brought forward a new weapon: field artillery. Two small cannons, crude by modern measure but devastating in their effect, began to pound the English lines. For the first time, the longbowmen faced a weapon they could not outrange, could not silence. The very tool that had once broken the knight's charge was now rendered obsolete by fire and smoke. Kyriel's army wavered under the bombardment, but for a brief moment, English discipline held. They advanced and captured the French guns, thinking victory was theirs. Then Richemont's fresh forces appeared from the west, striking like thunder. The English, caught between two armies, broke. Men who had marched under the banner of St. George for generations now fled for their lives. When the dust settled, the English army was destroyed. Formigny was not just a defeat, it was the breaking of the English spell. Normandy was lost. The fall of Rouen, Caen and Cherbourg followed swiftly. The Norman people, once accustomed to English rule, no longer resisted the French reconquest. They saw which way the wind was blowing. The fleur-de-lis returned to castle walls where the lions of England had once flown. Chroniclers in Paris rejoiced. After more than a century of humiliation, France was whole again. But the story was not over. The heart of English power in France had always been further south, in Gascony, a land of vineyards, merchants, and proud loyalty to England. For 3 centuries, since the days of Eleanor of Aquitaine, this region had been tied to the English crown. It was more than territory, it was heritage. The Gascons spoke French, but thought of themselves as English subjects. To them, the English king was not a foreign conqueror, but their rightful lord. When Normandy fell, Henry VI's government in London refused to accept reality. They sent reinforcements to Gascony, hoping to reclaim their glory. In 1452, John Talbot, the veteran Earl of Shrewsbury, landed at Bordeaux. To his surprise, the city welcomed him with open arms. The people still believed in the old alliance. For a moment it seemed that England's fortunes might be reborn, but France had changed. The days when English soldiers could sweep across the countryside unopposed were gone. Charles VII's reformed army moved with precision and purpose. In 1453, the French struck back, and Talbot's small force met them at Castillon, near the Dordogne River. What followed was a battle that ended not only an army, but an era. The English, confident from their earlier triumphs, attacked the French camp, thinking it to be in retreat. They did not realize it was a fortified position bristling with cannon. The French artillery, now far more advanced than at Formigny, unleashed a storm of fire that tore through English ranks. Talbot, over 70 years old and still riding into battle in full armor, tried to rally his men. But courage could not stop iron. The sky filled with smoke and flame. Horses screamed. Arrows fell short against walls of earth and wood. When the battle ended, Talbot lay dead among thousands of his men. The chroniclers say his body was found beside that of his son, both cut down in the same charge. The defeat at Castillon shattered the last English army in France. Within weeks, Bordeaux surrendered once more, this time for good. Gascony, held for 300 years, was gone. In London, the news struck like a hammer. The loss of France, so long a source of pride, trade and ambition, left the realm adrift. For generations, English kings had measured their greatness by their dominion across the Channel. Now, there was nothing left but Calais, a lonely outpost clinging to the edge of France, a reminder of what had been. Chroniclers wrote with sorrow and disbelief, the realm of France, once ruled by England's kings, had vanished as if it had never been. Yet even in defeat, something remarkable had taken shape. France emerged from the 100 Years' War, not as the fragmented feudal kingdom it had been in 1337, but as a united nation. The crown now stood above the nobility. The army was loyal to the king, not to local lords. The war had burned away the old order. Out of its ashes came a modern monarchy, centralized, disciplined, and enduring. In England, the opposite occurred. The loss of France fractured what little stability remained. Henry VI, weak in body and mind, could not command the respect of his nobles. The vast expenses of the war, coupled with the humiliation of defeat, ignited old rivalries. The Duke of York, once a loyal servant, began to question the king's right to rule. In the streets of London, men whispered of betrayal, corruption, and divine punishment. The people, weary of foreign wars, turned their anger inward. The soldiers who returned from France brought with them not victory, but bitterness. They had lost their purpose, their livelihoods, their hope. As France rebuilt, England prepared to destroy itself in a new conflict. The Wars of the Roses, a civil war born from the ruin of the 100 Years' War. Looking back, one cannot help but feel the tragic symmetry. The war that began over a claim to the French crown ended with both kingdoms transformed, one united, the other divided. The ideals of chivalry that had once defined the medieval world lay shattered. The age of knights and heraldry gave way to the age of nations and kings. The 100 Years' War had lasted 116 years, longer than any man's lifetime, longer than the reigns of 5 English kings and 5 French ones. It had seen plague, famine, miracles, and madness. It had begun as a question of lineage, but it ended as the birth of 2 nations. The old Europe, the feudal Europe, died on its battlefields. When Bordeaux fell in 1453, few realized that they were witnessing not just the end of a war, but the close of an age. The cannons that thundered at Castillon did more than defeat an army. They silenced the world of chainmail and banners forever. The Middle Ages, born in faith and feudalism, ended in smoke and gunpowder. And so, with the loss of Gascony, England's dream of empire across the sea faded into legend. France, once torn apart, now stood as a single, sovereign realm. But peace did not mean serenity. The ghosts of 100 years of war lingered still, in the hearts of soldiers, in the fields of Normandy, in the memories of those who had known nothing but conflict. The 100 Years' War was over, but its shadow would stretch across Europe for centuries to come, shaping dynasties, faith, and the very idea of what it meant to be a nation. The war ended not with a treaty, but with exhaustion, a silence that stretched across the fields of France like a shroud. After 116 years of blood and dust, both kingdoms were drained of men, money, and spirit. The bells that once tolled for victory now rang for peace, but it was a peace few could recognize. The 100 Years' War had not merely redrawn borders, it had reshaped the very idea of what it meant to belong, to rule, to live. For the people of France, the war's end was both triumph and trauma. Villages that had known nothing but occupation began the slow work of rebuilding. Farmers returned to their fields to find them barren, their homes in ruins, their families scattered. Decades of raids had stripped the countryside bare, yet out of that ruin, a strange resilience bloomed. The French peasantry, who had borne the heaviest burden of war, now carried a new sense of pride, a belief that their suffering had meaning, that their endurance had saved the kingdom. The victory of Charles VII and his successors was not simply royal, it was national. For the first time, France was more than a collection of duchies, counties, and baronies. It was a nation. The people had fought not just for their lords, but for something greater, an idea called France. The monarch now stood above the feudal web, not within it. Taxation became regular, armies professional, justice centralized. The crown had learned from necessity that a kingdom divided cannot stand. In this sense, the 100 Years' War was France's crucible, the fire that forged its unity and identity. England, by contrast, turned inward, wounded, bitter, and unsure of itself. The loss of France left a vacuum in its soul. For over a century, English kings had looked across the Channel for their glory. Now, with that dream extinguished, they turned their gaze homeward, only to find division and resentment waiting. The nobility, enriched by war and emboldened by weakness at court, began to tear the kingdom apart. Within 2 years of the fall of Bordeaux, the Wars of the Roses erupted, cousin against cousin, Lancaster against York. The same dynastic logic that had started the 100 Years' War now consumed England itself. Yet in both kingdoms, amid ruin and rivalry, something new was being born. The medieval world, the world of feudal loyalty, chivalric valor, and sacred kingship, had not survived the war. In its place arose something harder, more pragmatic: the early modern state. Monarchs learned that authority must rest not on faith alone, but on institutions, taxes, and armies. The long romantic ideal of knighthood gave way to gunpowder and discipline. The bow, the lance, the shining charge of cavalry, all were rendered obsolete by artillery and strategy. The 100 Years' War had begun with knights in armor. It ended with cannons and contracts. The psychological transformation was just as profound. Before the war, a man's loyalty was personal, to his lord, his church, his family. After the war, it began to shift toward the land itself. England and France emerged not as realms of vassals, but as nations of people who shared a language, a memory, and a story. The word Englishman, once used loosely, now carried meaning. So too did Frenchman. Nationalism, that defining force of later centuries, found its first breath in the smoke of this medieval inferno. Art and literature, too, bore the marks of this transformation. Chroniclers like Froissart, who had once celebrated the pageantry of war, began to write with melancholy, even regret. The poets who followed, from Villon in France to Lydgate in England, spoke of loss, decay, and the passage of an age. The medieval dream of divine order had been replaced by the sobering knowledge of human fragility. The war had revealed the limits of both faith and valor. And yet, from those limits came legend. Joan of Arc, once condemned as a heretic, became the embodiment of France's soul. Her name, once whispered in fear, was now invoked in reverence. Though it would take centuries for the Church to canonize her officially, the people had already done so in their hearts. Her courage, her visions, her sacrifice, all became symbols of a faith that transcended defeat. In her, France found not only victory but redemption. England, too, found its legend, though of a different kind. Henry V, the warrior king of Agincourt, became the model of English valor. In the plays of Shakespeare, written generations later, he was immortalized not as a conqueror of France, but as an emblem of leadership, courage, and destiny. His words, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," would echo through time, shaping the English spirit long after his empire was gone. Both nations, in their own ways, turned tragedy into myth and myth into identity. The economic consequences of the war were equally vast. Trade routes were shattered, cities depopulated, and farmland left untended. Yet the survivors adapted. The decline of serfdom accelerated as labor became scarce. In both England and France, peasants demanded wages and rights, no longer content with the old bonds of feudal service. Towns grew in importance, merchants gained power. The rise of a money economy, already underway before the war, now became unstoppable. In the long shadow of the 100 Years' War, the seeds of capitalism and social mobility took root. The Church, too, was changed. Its authority, once unquestioned, had faltered. Too often it had blessed wars, justified bloodshed, and failed to protect the innocent. The great schism of the papacy during the war's middle years had shattered its moral unity. By 1453, faith remained, but trust had eroded. A century later, that erosion would culminate in the Reformation, a movement born in part from the disillusionment that wars like this had sown. It is tempting to view the 100 Years' War as senseless, a feud of kings fought over pride and inheritance. And in many ways it was. But it was also a mirror of humanity itself, our capacity for endurance, for adaptation, for finding meaning in suffering. Out of its ruin came innovation, out of its despair came unity, and out of its blood came the modern world. By the mid-15th century, Europe was no longer medieval. The Renaissance dawned, a rebirth of learning, art, and human inquiry. Printing presses would soon carry knowledge farther than armies ever had. Gunpowder had ended the rule of castles. Paper and ink would end the rule of ignorance. The 100 Years' War, for all its destruction, had cleared the ground for this new world to grow. Still, its ghosts lingered. In the songs of soldiers, in the prayers of widows, in the empty halls of once great castles, the memory of a century of conflict endured. Chroniclers wrote that in some French fields, bones still surfaced every spring, the earth itself refusing to forget. For England and France alike, the 100 Years' War became more than history. It became heritage. It was the story they told themselves when they spoke of who they were, the trials that shaped their destinies. And though both nations would fight again, often against one another, they would never again do so in the same medieval spirit. The war had changed them too deeply. The 100 Years. War began with a question of blood, who had the right to rule, and ended with the birth of two peoples who no longer needed to ask. The crown had lost its divine simplicity, the sword its unquestioned glory, but in their place rose something far more enduring: identity. The war had taken everything, lives, kingdoms, faith, and in return it had given Europe its first glimpse of the modern age. When the cannons fell silent at Castillon, 1,000 years of medieval history ended with them. The world that followed would be louder, faster, more human. The 100 Years' War was not just a conflict between England and France. It was the death of the Middle Ages and the birth of everything that came after. A war that lasted a century. The phrase itself feels impossible, as if time stretched and hardened around the ambitions of kings, the cries of soldiers, and the prayers of mothers waiting for sons who never returned. The 100 Years' War was not a single conflict, but a storm that raged across generations, reshaping two kingdoms and altering the trajectory of Europe forever. It began as a dynastic quarrel, an argument over titles and inheritance, but it became something far greater, a crucible that burned away the old medieval world and forged in its place the first outlines of the modern age. When Edward III claimed the French throne in 1337, he could not have foreseen the enormity of what he had unleashed. In his eyes, he sought only justice, a recognition of his hereditary right. Yet that claim would spark more than 100 years of war, interrupted by plagues, truces, and internal strife, but always returning like a fever that refused to break. Kingdoms rose and fell within its span. Entire generations lived and died beneath its shadow. The children born at Crécy would not live to see the peace that finally followed Castillon. It was, in every sense, a war that consumed lifetimes. And yet, amid its destruction, something extraordinary emerged. France, once a patchwork of feudal territories, slowly coalesced into a nation, not simply a collection of lords and fiefs, but a kingdom bound by language, identity, and faith. The endless struggle against a foreign invader gave the French people a sense of unity that no monarch alone could have inspired. The same was true, though differently shaped, for England. Cut off from its continental holdings, humiliated by defeat, England began to look inward, to define itself as an island realm, distinct and defiant, setting the foundations for a national consciousness that would echo through centuries of English pride and policy. The war transformed not just nations, but the very nature of warfare. At Crécy and Agincourt, the English longbow shattered the illusion of knightly invincibility. Armor and nobility no longer guaranteed survival. The battlefield became a place not of chivalric pageantry, but of discipline, tactics, and merciless efficiency. The professional soldier, paid, trained and loyal to his sovereign rather than his lord, replaced the mounted knight as the instrument of power. And behind the armies came the rise of artillery, the thunderous herald of a new age. Stone walls that had once stood impregnable for centuries were reduced to rubble in days. Castles, the symbols of feudal authority, were now relics of a dying order. It was also a war of ideas. The medieval belief in divine right and ordained hierarchy began to crack under the strain of blood and contradiction. Kings invoked God, but their wars brought famine and plague. Priests blessed armies, yet the cries of the wounded drowned out their prayers. In the villages, faith remained, but it changed, no longer a faith in the justice of rulers, but in the endurance of ordinary souls. The Church's authority, already shaken by the Great Schism, began to erode under the weight of suffering it could not explain. Out of that vacuum, a new kind of thought would emerge, skeptical, human, searching. The seeds of the Renaissance were scattered amid the ruins of battlefields, and then there were the people, countless and voiceless, yet they carried the war upon their backs. Peasants conscripted to fight or to feed armies. Towns burned, rebuilt and burned again. Women left to guard homes, farms and families in a world that seemed to have forgotten peace. The chronicles speak of kings and captains, of banners and treaties, but the true story of the 100 Years' War was written in the silent endurance of those who survived it. They are the invisible protagonists, the mothers of Orléans, the farmers of Gascony, the sailors at Sluys, the archers from Wales who marched under foreign skies. They were the ones who rebuilt when the armies moved on. Out of all its tragedies, no figure embodies the paradox of the war more powerfully than Joan of Arc. A teenage girl who rose from obscurity, guided by faith and conviction, she did what no army could. She restored belief to a broken nation. Her voice cut through the cynicism of politics and the fatigue of endless war. In her, France saw not merely a soldier, but a savior, a reminder that destiny could still be shaped by courage. Her death, cruel and unjust, transformed her from warrior to martyr, from a peasant girl to a saint who would one day define the spirit of a nation. Her ashes fell into the river, but her faith spread like wildfire. Through her, France found its soul again. For England, the war's end marked a different kind of transformation. The loss of France, the dream of empire across the Channel, forced England to look homeward. Within decades, the Wars of the Roses would erupt, tearing apart the very nobility that had once ruled with such pride. Yet even in defeat, England emerged stronger in another sense. Its monarchy, stripped of continental distractions, began to consolidate authority at home. The seeds of centralized governance, bureaucracy and naval ambition were planted in the ashes of France. The nation that lost the 100 Years' War would, in time, become the one that ruled the seas. The war also changed the language of politics. For centuries, the English aristocracy had spoken French, the language of courts, law, and culture. But as the war dragged on, English identity demanded its own voice. By the 15th century, English replaced French as the tongue of Parliament, the courts, and the crown. Chaucer's verse became the literature of a people who no longer saw themselves as a branch of France, but as a nation apart. Out of defeat came a new voice, the voice of England itself. And what in the end was achieved? France kept its crown, England lost its continental lands. Yet the deeper outcome was not territorial, but psychological. Europe learned that no single crown could claim universal rule. Power had to be rooted in people, in administration, in the machinery of nationhood. The 100 Years' War was the slow birth of sovereignty, the painful realization that the world of knights and oaths could not survive in an age of nations. It was the death of feudalism and the baptism of modern politics. The scars, though, remained. Villages destroyed, farmlands wasted, generations of orphans, widows, and broken men. The economy of Europe trembled under the weight of its losses. Yet even amid ruin, human creativity refused to die. Out of the aftermath came new architecture, new art, new systems of trade. It was as though humanity, having glimpsed the depths of its own violence, began to dream of beauty again. Cathedrals were rebuilt, cities flourished, and the very weapons once forged for war were repurposed to carve statues, print books, and build ships of exploration. History remembers wars as lines on a timeline, dates, battles, treaties. But the 100 Years' War was more than an event. It was a transformation of identity, of thought, of purpose. It asked Europe the question that would define its future. What does it mean to belong? To a crown, to a land, to an idea? In the centuries that followed, the echoes of that question never faded. The centralized monarchies of France and England would become empires. The nationalism born in blood would spread, shaping revolutions and colonies alike. Joan of Arc would be canonized, Henry V immortalized on stage. But beyond the myths and legends, one truth endures: that history is not written only by victors, but by survivors. The 100 Years' War stands as both warning and testament. That ambition can last a lifetime, but endurance can last an age. It showed that even the mightiest kings are mortal, but the idea of a nation, once born, cannot be unmade. And as we look back across those 100 years, through the smoke of Crécy, the silence of plague, the fire of Orléans, and the ashes of Bordeaux, we see not just a chronicle of battles, but a reflection of ourselves, the eternal struggle between destruction and creation, despair and hope, power and purpose. The war ended in 1453, but its resonance did not. It lingers in the languages we speak, in the borders we draw, in the concept of who we are. For in that long century of conflict, Europe learned not merely how to fight, but how to become. And so, as the last echoes fade from the fields of Normandy, and the bells of Rheims toll softly in the distance, the 100 Years' War passes into legend, a mirror of human endurance and folly of nations, born through blood and belief. It was never truly about crowns. It was about identity. The relentless will of humanity to define itself, even amid ruin, even against time. The smoke clears, the banners fall, and what remains is history itself, eternal, echoing softly through the corridors of time. It began with fire. Flames licked the sky above a small French village, the bells of its chapel ringing wildly as if to cry for mercy. Smoke coiled through the valley, heavy with the smell of ash, scorched wheat, and fear. Children clung to their mothers. Old men watched their homes crumble. Somewhere beyond the haze, the English banners fluttered, red crosses on white cloth, a foreign wind carrying the echoes of conquest. This was not the first fire, and it would not be the last. Europe in the 14th century was a world on the edge of transformation. The old order, bound by faith, feudalism, and family, was beginning to fray. Kings still ruled by divine right, yet behind their crowns lurked ambition, greed, and the restless pull of destiny. When King Charles IV of France died in 1328 without a male heir, it seemed a matter of simple inheritance. Yet from that silence, from the vacant throne of a single man, arose one of the longest and most devastating wars in European history. A war that would last more than a century. A war that would define two nations, England and France, not merely as kingdoms, but as ideas. It began, as so many wars do, not with the sword, but with a question of blood. Edward III of England, proud, brilliant, barely 20 years old, claimed that through his mother, Isabella, daughter of a French king, he had the truest right to the throne of France. The French nobles rejected the claim, invoking the Salic law. No woman nor her offspring could inherit the French crown. They crowned Philip VI, cousin to the dead king. But Edward's pride could not accept this denial. To him it was not only a slight upon his lineage, but an insult to his honour. The claim became a cause. The cause became a banner. And beneath that banner marched tens of thousands. At first it seemed a family quarrel, the kind that Europe's monarchs had waged for generations. Yet this quarrel grew, century after century, into a struggle that reshaped the map, the faith, and the soul of Western civilization. In those early days, the war still smelled of chivalry. Knights rode beneath painted shields. Heralds sang of valor and loyalty. The code of honor was still alive, or so they told themselves. Yet on the fields of France, the longbow would soon make such ideals obsolete. Steel and courage could not stand against the cold precision of 1,000 arrows. The war would reveal the truth beneath the romance, that courage alone could not stop change. The 100 Years' War was never just one war. It was a chain of wars, battles, truces, betrayals, and resurrections, fought by men who rarely lived long enough to see its end. It was a story carried forward by generations, born beneath the shadow of vengeance. For the English, it was destiny. For the French, survival. In the streets of Paris, whispers of pride and defiance mingled with prayers for peace. In London, merchants toasted victories, while mothers waited for sons who would never return. Across the Channel, armies marched through villages where the peasants had no stake in crowns or coats of arms, only in the grain they tried to harvest before soldiers took it. Everywhere the war seeped into the soil. It turned farmers into fugitives, nuns into healers, and kings into legends. At Crécy, at Poitiers, at Agincourt, fields became graves, and graves became symbols. Each generation believed it could end the conflict. Each left it burning brighter than before. Yet to call it simply a war of crowns would be to miss its deeper rhythm. Beneath every siege and treaty lay the slow heartbeat of transformation. This was the age when loyalty began to shift from feudal lords to nations, when language and land began to define identity, when England began to think of itself as English and France as French. The 100 Years' War gave birth to nationalism and killed the medieval dream of unity under God as universal order. It was a war that unmade the world that had once seemed eternal. When Edward III raised his claim, he did not foresee that it would last beyond his sons, beyond his grandsons, that the quarrel he began would still rage 100 years later under different kings, different banners, and different prayers. By the time it ended, Europe itself had changed beyond recognition. The feudal lords, who once ruled like miniature kings, found their castles in ruins. The church that had blessed knights on their crusades now stood divided, its authority weakened by schism and doubt. The plague had thinned the ranks of both armies and believers, teaching men that death came not only from the sword, but from the air they breathed. And yet, through all this, the war continued. Sometimes fierce, sometimes forgotten, always returning like a fever. Because it was no longer merely about a crown, it had become about meaning. For England, victory in France promised legitimacy, a divine confirmation that their monarchy, their army, their faith were chosen. For France, resistance became a kind of prayer, a sacred defense of home and identity. Every burned village, every fallen knight added weight to that cause. In the minds of kings, it was a game of thrones. In the hearts of the people, it was a struggle to endure. The 100 Years' War taught Europe that destiny was not written in bloodlines, but in will. And yet within this grim tapestry, moments of light endured. The English chroniclers wrote of the Black Prince, Edward's son, whose courage and chivalry inspired men to follow him into hopeless battles. The French found their miracle in Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who, claiming divine voices, led armies and revived the spirit of a dying nation. Between these two figures, the noble knight and the humble saint, the war revealed its true nature. not simply the conflict of two crowns, but of two visions of faith, honor, and the human soul. Across the century, Europe watched as kings died and dynasties shifted. As the English kings lost their foothold in France, the French kings found new strength in unity. The tide turned not through treaties, but through transformation. The old medieval world of feudal loyalty, divine kingship, and armored faith began to fade beneath the smoke of cannons. Gunpowder replaced gallantry. Siege towers gave way to artillery. The knight's code, once the highest ideal, became an echo from another age. And yet through the suffering, something new was born. France emerged from the ashes, scarred but sovereign, no longer a patchwork of lords, but a nation under a single crown. England, stripped of its French possessions, turned inward, planting the seeds of its own civil wars, but also of its future identity as an island realm. The 100 Years' War was both destruction and creation, apocalypse and Genesis entwined. It tore apart the medieval order, yet out of that ruin came the first glimpse of modern Europe. By its end, men no longer believed that God chose kings through ancestry alone. They had seen too many crowned heads fall, too many anointed rulers fail. The people too had changed, not yet citizens, but no longer mere subjects. The war had taught them that power could shift, that destiny could be defied, that even peasants could shape history. And as the fires died and the fields grew green once more, the memory remained of a time when England and France, two proud nations, fought not only for land and legacy, but for the right to exist. This was not a single conflict. It was a century of endurance, of triumph and tragedy, of faith and fury. A century that began with a question of blood and ended with the death of an age. Europe in the early 14th century stood at the threshold of transformation. A continent balanced between the fading twilight of the medieval world and the first light of something new. The air was thick with faith, fear, and ambition. The bells of Christendom rang across a land bound by feudal duty and divine right, yet beneath the surface, power was shifting. The church still crowned kings, but its word no longer silenced questions. The nobility still ruled through blood and land, but wealth was finding new voices in the rising towns and trade routes. And in the courts of kings, the old bonds of fealty were giving way to a more dangerous idea: sovereignty. In this age, kings were not just rulers, they were symbols of God's order. Their right to rule was believed to flow from heaven itself. Yet heaven, it seemed, had grown crowded with claimants. Two of the mightiest houses of Europe, the Capetians of France and the Plantagenets of England, had been bound together by marriage, trade, and rivalry for generations. For nearly 3 centuries, the kings of England had held vast lands in France, not as conquerors, but as vassals of the French crown. This delicate balance, an English king kneeling to a French one, created a tension that could never last. The Capetian dynasty had ruled France since the 10th century, building a kingdom of remarkable unity and wealth. Their line had passed smoothly from father to son for 300 years, until it didn't. In 1328, King Charles IV died without a male heir, ending the direct Capetian line. And with his death, a question arose that would haunt Europe for the next 100 years. Who would wear the crown of France? There were 2 possible claimants. One was Philip of Valois, a cousin of the late king and a member of a cadet branch of the Capetian family. The other was Edward III of England, the young and ambitious monarch whose mother, Isabella, was Charles IV's sister, a Capetian princess. By the strict logic of blood, Edward's claim seemed strong, but the French court rejected it, citing the Salic law, an ancient Frankish code that forbade inheritance through the female line. The peers of France declared Philip the rightful king, and he ascended as Philip VI. To Edward, this was not only a political insult, but a challenge to his dignity and lineage. His mother had been a French princess, his grandfather a French king. To deny his right was to deny his blood. For a time, he accepted the decision, distracted by rebellions at home and the need to consolidate his rule. But the wound festered, and in that wound lay the seed of war. The stage was set not only for a clash of armies, but for a collision of identities. The struggle between Edward and Philip was not just a dynastic dispute. It was the beginning of a new kind of conflict, where the idea of a nation began to stir beneath the armor of kings. England and France were bound together by centuries of entanglement. The Norman conquest of 1066 had made the kings of England lords of vast French territories, Normandy, Aquitaine, and Gascony. English kings spoke French, dressed in French fashion, and married into French families. Yet by the 14th century, the tide of language and loyalty was changing. The English tongue was re-emerging in law and literature. A sense of Englishness was taking root among nobles and commoners alike. This rising identity collided with a French monarchy seeking to assert its absolute authority. Philip VI and his successors sought to centralize power, to reclaim lands and loyalty once divided among semi-independent lords. But to do so, they had to break the influence of England on French soil. The two kingdoms were moving toward collision, not by chance, but by destiny. The economic pressures of the age added fuel to the flame. England's wealth rested heavily on its wool trade, which flowed through the cloth towns of Flanders, regions that owed fealty to the French crown. When Philip sought to cut off English trade, he struck at England's livelihood. Edward responded with bold defiance, declaring himself the rightful King of France in 1340. What had begun as a question of inheritance now erupted into a crusade of legitimacy. To his people, Edward became a figure of divine mission, a king anointed not just by God, but by justice itself. He fashioned his claim as a sacred duty, a restoration of the rightful order denied him by deceit. To Philip, Edward's declaration was treason, a dangerous challenge to the unity of France. Both kings saw themselves as chosen. Both would drag their nations into a war that would outlive them by generations. This was the world of the 14th century, where chivalry still dressed violence in the language of honor, and banners bore the faces of saints to sanctify ambition. Yet beneath that glittering surface, the realities of power were changing. Armies were growing larger and more professional. Mercenaries, men who fought for coin, not country, roamed the countryside, selling their swords to the highest bidder. The church, once the moral compass of Christendom, was splintered by corruption and political intrigue. The papacy itself had moved from Rome to Avignon, where its proximity to the French crown cast shadows of favoritism and manipulation. Faith remained strong, but certainty was fading. And into this uncertain world rode men like Edward III, soldiers, kings, dreamers of empire. His reign would see both the height of English glory and the first signs of decline. He was brilliant in command, adored by his soldiers, and ambitious beyond measure. Yet even he could not foresee the cost of what he began. By his side, his son, Edward, the Black Prince, would become the embodiment of chivalric excellence, leading English troops to legendary victories at Crécy and Poitiers. His name would echo in French nightmares for decades, but his triumphs would also mark the beginning of the end for the knightly ideal. On the other side, France would find its salvation not in royal blood, but in endurance. Kings would fall, cities would burn, but the heart of France would keep beating, carried by men and women who refused to surrender. Among them, a peasant girl from Domremy would one day rise, claiming voices from heaven to turn despair into deliverance. Joan of Arc, a figure both miraculous and tragic, would reignite the flame of French unity when all seemed lost. Between these figures, Edward III, Philip VI, the Black Prince, Charles V, Henry V, and Joan of Arc, the century would unfold like a great tapestry, woven with threads of pride, vengeance, and faith. Each would inherit the war differently, yet each would leave a mark that shaped the age to come. The 100 Years' War was not a straight path of conquest and defeat, but a long dance of advance and retreat, peace and betrayal. Its rhythm was measured not only in battles but in generations, in the slow grinding of exhaustion that reshaped Europe as soul. It was, in many ways, the last great war of the Middle Ages, and the first of the modern era. In its opening decades, knights still ruled the battlefield, their armor gleaming beneath banners of lions and fleurs-de-lis. But by its end, the world of the knight was gone. Archers and foot soldiers, common men, would decide the fate of kings. The longbow, the cannon, and the gunpowder siege would render the shining armor of chivalry obsolete. This transformation was not sudden. It came battle by battle, year by year, as the very tools of war stripped away its pageantry. By 1453, when the war finally ended, the Europe that remained was not the one that began it. Feudalism had weakened, monarchies had grown stronger, the church had lost its absolute power, and the people, once pawns in the feudal game, had begun to glimpse their own place in history. The 100 Years' War did not merely redraw borders, it redrew belief itself in kings, in God, and in destiny. It taught a continent that identity was not inherited but forged. From the coronation of a child king to the death of a saintly maiden, from the thunder of longbows to the silence of burned villages, it was a story of both ruin and rebirth. A century of struggle that began with the question of who should rule and ended with the question of what it meant to be a nation.